We are excited to have Dr. Arnold speak with us today on the issue of Israel's Yahweh among the religions of the ancient world. This presentation explores various views on the conceptualization of deity in antiquity, with a particular emphasis on the God of the Hebrew Bible, and a focus on the concept of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible and problems related to the term monotheism itself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Arnold to speak to us.
Thank you, Thomas. Fascinating introduction. I'm exhausted listening to that. I didn't know I'd done all that, so thank you. It's such an honor to be here. Before I begin my formal presentation, I want to say a word about just how much of an honor it is to be here. As Thomas mentioned, I'm an HUC grad, a proud HUC grad, and I got here early so I could walk around, see the campus, reminisce. Jason was kind enough to let me into, where did he go, Jason? Oh, there you are, he's hiding. Kind enough to let me into the main administrative, the Herman Learning Center, I think, so I could walk through the Hall of Fame and see some of my professors are now on that wall, and that was great. Oh, John, good to see you, John. I'm all the way from, okay, good to see some old friends here. As a part of continuing that personal note, I just wanted to show a proof that I was here. It's hard to tell now, but that's me in the middle. You wouldn't know it, but that is. And Dr. Gottschalk, right, and David B. Weisberg on the left was one of my two main, he and Sam Gringus were my two main dissertation mentors. So those were good years. And I've been grateful all my professional career for HUC. I'm going to take another word about this. I've had colleagues at the institution where I teach with PhDs in Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And I would put up against their training what I did in Cincinnati at HUC any day of the week. In fact, usually I would say what I did was better than what, in most cases, than what they did. So I'm very proud of that. And okay, that's enough of that picture. Just wanted to put some of that in perspective and let you know what a true honor it is for me to be here today. God is a really popular topic just now. It is more precise to say that a great deal of scholarly work has appeared recently on how the ancients conceived and talked about God and the deities around the world. I counted 21, and I'm not expecting you to look at the next two slides and actually read them, but I counted 21 serious monographs or articles, and most of these are in the past 10 years. And some of these are by leading scholars in our field. Many of these studies have focused especially on the origin, nature, and characterization of the God of the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh. In a current research project, I was asked by the editors of a forthcoming volume on the religions around the Old Testament to respond to various chapters on each of the people groups and their religious conceptions. Sumerian religion, Assyrian religion, Babylonian religion, and on we go through the list. And so I was asked if I would read each of their chapters and write a concluding chapter asking, okay, what does this imply about ancient Israel's view of Yahweh? Given the dizzying diversity of religious worldviews and practices among these people groups, what might we discern as the conceptual commonality between them, and how might that provide a background for the ancient Israelites and their view of God? And so I dutifully read each essay and was impressed by how reading them together brings into focus a vivid picture of that commonality, even if the picture is somewhat pixelated. This presentation today is an attempt to step away from the pixelated image just a bit in order to discern more carefully the religious and ideological background of Israel's understanding of Yahweh. What emerges in the foreground is a clearer perception of Israel's Yahweh among the gods of the ancient world. So I will here address two questions. What conceptual commonality might there be among the religious systems of the ancient world? And given that commonality, what does this background suggest about the Hebrew Bible's perception of Yahweh compared to all these other nations and people groups? So the paper will have two parts. First, I will go through and summarize this commonality. What's the conceptual commonality among all the other people groups of the ancient world? And then secondly, I'll look at Israel in particular and ask, what do we glean, what can we glean by comparing Israel to all of these others? Here I condense my observations after reading all these essays on various religious systems by considering 5 features that emerged in the essays, which are underlying religious conceptions shared across the ancient world. So first and most obvious, divine numbers. Now, as I go through these 5, you will say, well, so what? We know this, especially for this first one. But there's a sequence in which these 5 develop, and they have ramifications that progress through all 5 of them. They're logically continuous. And so first, divine numbers. Ancient peoples perceived the cosmos as permeated with deities. The religious systems described here show that practically every aspect of human life had a specific god or goddess associated with it. That god or goddess acted as the divine protector and the supreme master of that activity. Especially prolific, for example, were the Hittites of Anatolia, which paid service to celestial gods, storm, sun, moon, stars, earth gods, including olden gods of the underworld, nature gods, wine, grain, the wild stag, mountains, springs, rivers, gods of everything. Deities of motherhood, magic, war, plague, deities of inanimate objects such as altars, hearths, windows, door bolts, thrones, anything could be worshipped as a god. Similarly, the Arameans, I'm going to not drag you through all, whatever there were, 15 of those chapters. I could do the similar kind of illustration with almost every one of these people groups. Herodotus famously identified Egyptian deities with Greek ones, illustrating the tendency to merge deities in a process of interpretatio Greco, a way of explaining the wider world in Greek terms. The gods and goddesses of all other peoples were simply differently named versions of the Greek gods. Deities of the ancient world were routinely represented in one of 4 forms: anthropomorphic, theuromorphic, mixed, or inanimate. So the deities were portrayed as having human form, they looked like us, or they were portrayed in animal form, theuromorphic, they looked like certain animals, or they were mixed. Some deities had part human forms, part animal forms, or different types of animals. I'm going to show you some photographs in a few moments. Or, as I mentioned a moment ago, they could be gods of inanimate objects. Almost anything could be attributed as a deity. So, in terms of numbers, they could be worshipped in many different ways, but also in this first point, I would say the gods in the perception of these people groups were translatable, by which I mean they were recognized cross-culturally. People in the ancient world easily identified their own gods with deities of other cultures that they encountered. Perhaps the most dramatic example is the goddess known best by her Greek name, Astarte, who is also in Ugaritic Astartu, or Phoenician Ashtart. Hebrew, we have Ashtoreth and Ashtaroth in the plural. Egyptian, I won't try to pronounce that one. Hittite, I'm not really going to pronounce that one either. Sumerian, because Sam Green has taught me Sumerian, I'll say Inanna, and then the Akkadian form Ishtar. So it's Ishtar in all the different cultural settings, but it's still Ishtar, or is she. This deity has the ability to serve as goddess of love, war, the planet Venus, across a number of cultures and religious expressions, even overlapping with the Hurrian text of the Hittites, Shaushka, as I said before. Eventually, the idea of all gods worshiping the same deities under different names culminated in the belief in a supreme being, Greek Hypsistos, the highest one, absorbing in its essence all the major deities of other religions as a super deity. Usually that's Zeus, Serapis, Helios, or among the Gnostics, Yao. So divine numbers, but let me move quickly now to divine relations. Besides being virtually limitless in number, the gods and goddesses discussed here are much like people. They relate to each other in families and societies, cutting across nearly all cultural expressions. The deities are described as having familiar relationships with each other as mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, brothers, in-laws. The ancient Near Eastern societies had kinship-based tribal organizations, and in that setting, they thought of individual identity as determined by the household and the tribe of one's birth, whereas collectively, identity was determined by the deity to which one's household belonged. In Mesopotamia, the god lists of deities could be described very much like humans, inhabiting homes with their families, like temples, sleeping, dressing, eating, enjoying entertainment, assembling, even having conflict with each other and capable of being deceived. And so divine relations. And then thirdly, divine hierarchies. The similarities between human kinship and divine relationships led naturally to a perceived distinction between what may be called official religion and that of the kinship system of the household. The former, official religion, was typically a form of state religion and usually came complete with a hierarchy of pantheon, giving order and structure to the cosmos. This distinction seems particularly evident among the highest civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, so that in Egypt you can have a monumental temple, which was known to everyone, but they also had smaller chapels distributed throughout the country, which were used mostly by the families or smaller groups, city-states and the nomes. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, you're familiar with the huge ziggurats and the massive temples in some of the Mesopotamian cities, but they also had, especially in Babylon itself, chapels at almost every crossroad that were for the local practice of the families and the people of that quarter of the city. Smaller societies, besides Egypt and Mesopotamia, tended to rely on kinship-based religion and typically relied on fewer deities, focusing divine powers in the high gods of that culture. So, for example, a more generalist deity like the Chemosh of Moab functions as a one-stop shop god, like Marduk or Ashur or Amun in Egypt, yet on a much more parochial and local level. So then we move to divine boundaries. The divine image in ancient perceptions was, for lack of a better term, fluid. That is, the category of the nature, divine nature, was fuzzily bounded in the imaginations of the ancients. Indeed, divine forces were thought of as distinct selves, and yet they could fragment and overlap and work independently or even at odds with each other. So we've spoken about Ishtar already. There are at least 4 expressions or versions of Ishtar in ancient Assyria. And the scholarship is still not at a consensus as to whether these were distinct goddesses of the same name or whether they were somehow local manifestations or epistatic aspects of the same goddess. And here you have a picture of the lovely Ishtar. The Hittite gods were thought to be in more than one place at a time, including in lands far distant from their temples in Hatti land in Anatolia, in which case those gods needed to be drawn back to their cult images by means of evocation so they could attend to the rites in their honor. So their gods tended to drift and they had to be pulled back so they could be worshipped properly. Indeed, the major deities of the ancient Near East seem to consist of a constellation of detachable parts, accumulated names, attributes, manifestations, all with an anthropomorphic core at its center, at their centers. Each of these gods and goddesses retain a degree of uniqueness and individuality, and yet paradoxically, they can lose their individuality. Marduk is not Baal, Hathor is not Isis, Ishtar is not Nabu, well, until they sort of are. Then we move to, had one further thing to say there. No, I didn't. We're ready to move on now to number. Before I get to number 5, just another word about Ishtar, because we love Ishtar so much. Here you see Ishtar on the right, and she's sort of astride a lion and becomes identified with the lion. Among other things, she's identified with a lot of things, sexual virility, war, but also the lion. So if you go to the so-called Ishtar Gate of Babylon, which is preserved for us in Berlin at the Pergamum Museum, you see these glazed brick images of the lions going down the processional way. Well, that is Ishtar. So which is that Ishtar? Is it the lion itself, or is it this representation of Ishtar? And the answer is yes. That's not a problem. Another example, Marduk, the god of Babylon, he's astride a stream of water, and most of the scholars of iconography say if you look at that stream of water, it has two clear parts. There's a line in the middle. So there's a possibility that this is after the Enuma Elish or during the Enuma Elish, and the water has been divided. With half he creates the cosmos, and the other half he creates, the dome above and the earth below. But notice he's also got associated with him a dragon of some sort. The Mushkushu in Akkadian, just dragon. Well, you go back to the Ishtar gate again, and not on the processional way, but the gate itself, you have many representations of this creature on the left, which is a fascinating creature because he's got all the most powerful attributes of several different animals. The scorpion's tail, but a lion's claw, a dragon head, and that's the Mushkushu is Marduk. So which is it? Is that Marduk or is this Marduk? And the answer again, or is the cloud itself Marduk? Is the storm Marduk? And the answer, of course, is yes. All that is true. Now, number 5, divine additions. We have seen how any individual god can acquire multiple traits within themselves while maintaining their individuality. Any particular deity is best understood by means of a constellation of different elements. The fuller portrait of any deity is only properly perceived as the sum of its parts, and the more numerous the deified aspects, number, precious stone, astral reflection, the greater the deity. So by additions in this heading, I refer to the way in which any individual culture may add more deities to its pantheon without the need to subtract or diminish the total number of gods. In this way, ancient Near Eastern religions could be said to be conservative in nature. They can add new ones while holding on to the old ones. New deities could be added over time according to the needs and political changes of the society without subtracting any of the previous gods, which now come to be understood as the olden gods, often with great veneration and respect. One of the authors of one of the chapters, Richard Averbeck on the Sumerians, says this about the Sumerians, which holds true for all the other ones in the volume, in these chapters. Later traditions do not normally replace earlier ones, but transform and reshape them in response to new developments in religious, historical, political, cultural, and economic conditions, end quote. Now let me summarize. Oops, did I show you this? I didn't show you. That's the point. And this is a picture of the pharaonic gods. If you look up how many were specifically gods of the pharaohs, it goes into the hundreds, which is not to get into the full pantheon, just the gods that are focused on the pharaoh himself. So this is a summary of what we said so far, the first part of the presentation. What is the common conceptualization of the deities among all these people groups of the ancient Near East? And I would say you have five pieces of that. The first is really obvious to all of us, and then there's a flow in the way these fit together. Now, this leads to one of our questions about conceptual commonalities. What did the ancients think was happening in the late Bronze Age, so 1550 to 1200 BC roughly? What did the ancients think was happening in that period when Marduk was elevated to a chief deity over Babylon? Ashur was the chief god in Assyria. Aten became the chief deity for 15 minutes in the Amarna period. And then after the Amarna period, Amun-Re is elevated to a chief deity. What did they think was happening in this process? The evidence has led some to suggest there was a general impulse toward the worship of one god at the exclusion of others in the late Bronze Age across the ancient world, a so-called theology of exaltation. Now I have to pause and say there are many exceptions to this. It certainly didn't happen everywhere, and even where it did happen, they didn't deny the existence of the other gods. So whether you use the term monotheism or not, that's a problem. Using the term is a problem. If you qualify it with theology of exaltation, okay, well, maybe we'll talk about that at the end of the paper. Some have discerned a similar impulse to one God devotion in the worship of Ahura Mazda and Achaemenid times, although it certainly didn't hold true to be monotheism there. Something similar can be said of Zeus Hypsistos, the highest Zeus in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, although this may have been partly influenced by Jewish beliefs later on. However it is to be explained, this impulse to one God devotion never quite attains anything like genuine monotheism in this discussion so far, because I've used the term monotheism in quotation marks to show that it is wholly inadequate to carry much weight in our discussions like this. Now, the Hebrew Bible in the foreground with all of this background, and I'll come to the question of monotheism toward the end. With this ancient Near Eastern background in view, we turn now to ask how these observations might illuminate ancient Israel's understanding of Yahweh and his defining characteristics. The various polytheisms of these people groups converge in their descriptions of their gods, with their numerous fluid and shape-shifting deities, ever-growing in number, related to each other in families and social hierarchies, resulting in a clearer backdrop of Israelite religious expressions. This investigation clarifies that the lines of distinction between a narrowly defined monotheism against the backdrop of ancient polytheisms are much more porous than we might imagine, and that tendencies toward various kinds of monolatries were evident at certain stages of ancient history in what has often been called insular monotheisms. That's a quote from one of the scholars who contributed to this volume. Polytheism in general could integrate such impulses toward one God devotion without difficulty. The essays that I read for this study illustrate that what was once taken for granted as the essential difference between Israelite religion, that is, monotheism, was what made it distinctive, and that over polytheism needs considerable nuancing. Reducing Israelite theology to a question of mathematics is asking the wrong question, whether by comparison to other ancient religions or not. And so then what is the right question? And how do we go about answering that question in light of all this recent work done on ancient religion? Well, we begin, of course, with the Hebrew Bible's explicit statements in its portraiture of Yahweh. Numerous individual texts suggest what may be called practical monotheism, by which I mean passages that are often taken as explicit denial of the existence of other gods. Oh, I see that using this system has changed my fonts. Okay, well, at least you can read it. It's not as beautiful as the Hebrew font I was using, but you can read this. Atahor eta lada'at, ki Adonai hu ha'elohim, ein od milvado. And you have the translation here. I've highlighted especially that last word. Okay, I'm going to walk through several others, but do them very briefly and come back in a few moments and say something about milvado. So you have also in chapter 4 of the same book, you must know today, indeed take this to heart, that it is Yahweh who is God in heaven above and upon earth below. There is no other. See then that I am he. There is no God besides me. This is going to be very much related to the same word I emphasized before. I deal death, I give life, I wound, I heal. None can deliver from my hand, chapter 32 of Deuteronomy. Then we turn to Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, chapter 44:6. Thus says Yahweh, the King of Israel, his Redeemer, Yahweh, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, again, related to the word we're going to talk about, there is no God. I'm emphasizing these because these are the passages people turn to talk about denial of the existence of other gods. And therefore, we often raise the question of monotheism. Another one from Isaiah, do not fear and do not be afraid. Have I not told you from old and declared it? You are my witnesses. Is there not any God besides me? There is no other. I know none. I am Yahweh, again from Isaiah. There is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I gird you for battle. We have besides me again at the end. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make weal and woe. I am Yahweh, do all these things. I'm Yahweh, there's no other. I'm actually giving you every one of the important texts. They're all here. That's it. Now, there are several additional passages besides these that we've just looked at that seem connected to these, if not wholly dependent upon these. And they are here on the screen for you. 1 Kings, 2 Kings, more from Isaiah, Nehemiah, Psalms, and even others that suggest only an implicit monotheism, by which I mean they refer to the incomparability of Yahweh. And those are the ones at the bottom of this bullet point from Psalms, more from Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Joel. Of particular import in most of these texts is the compound preposition milavad, or variations of it. So I had it underlined in the very first example. Other examples of something related to that, bilbadai in Isaiah 45:6, or equivalent prepositions, imad, apart from me, imad, connoting except, apart from, besides, often with a suffix, besides him, besides me, and marked with italics in some of these examples that I've just expressed. Now, while the expression itself at first glance seems to assert that Yahweh is alone in the cosmos, and thus only one deity, therefore monotheism, the context of most all of these passages stresses, the larger context stresses the incomparability of Yahweh, asserting instead Yahweh's species uniqueness. Among all other beings in the ancient world, none are worthy of the word Elohim. The intent of these texts, therefore, I would argue, is not to say there are no other deities except for Yahweh, but compared to Yahweh. Rather, like the insular monotheism we observed occasionally in ancient Near Eastern religions, this may be considered, and this is a quote from Adrian Schecker, a monotheism of transcendence that includes polytheism, if it's even monotheism at all. In this way, we may assert that the message of these texts is not less than monotheism, but somehow even more demanding than monotheism. For it would have been a simple thing. And the next line is a variation of a quote from Matityahu Tzavad. And this audience would appreciate that more than most audiences who hear this quote. It would have been a simple thing for Israel to remain loyal to Yahweh once they were convinced no other deities existed. But another thing altogether to be faithful in the face of the many powerful gods of the cosmos. I tell my students, it would have been easy for the Israelites to have kept the first two commandments if they were ontological, philosophical monotheists. Okay, well, why would we make idols if those other gods don't exist, or make God look like them? These texts therefore emphasize that Yahweh cannot be compared to the numerous deities of the ancient world. Yet it is not enough to say the Hebrew Bible considers Yahweh to be sovereign among other deities, a kind of sumo-deism, another term that's been invented to try to explain this. Instead, Yahweh alone is worthy of the title Elohim in a way that all other lesser beings are not. He alone is fully Elohim. All others, coexisting or not, preternatural or not, can in no way be compared to Yahweh in power or might or in any other categorical element defining deity. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, other deities of the ancient world, as well as other preternatural beings, are flattened out. That is to say, they are not provided with full characterization or given roles of agency. Yahweh shares many features with some of these deities, particularly Canaanite El, Canaanite Baal, perhaps Asherah. But even this is not the same as the translatability of the divine image we saw in the conceptual commonality of the other peoples of the ancient world. As we saw, while the various gods and goddesses of the ancient world are distinct from each other, they nevertheless at times so resemble each other as to appear to collapse into each other's identities, or at least their roles and their responsibilities in a process of divine convergence. However, Yahweh seems to have not suffered from the God merger phenomenon much, if at all. Translatability then, so I now move to the features that I'm going to list for you that are distinctives of Israel. By the way, I've cut this out of the part of the paper, but one of my conclusions would be the often asked question of what is distinctive about the ancient Israelites. And nowadays, especially among archaeologists, the answer is there's nothing distinctive about the Israelites. They dressed like Canaanites or Amorites. They spoke like them. They looked like them. They were essentially Canaanites. And my response to that is, when you understand the differences in the way they perceive of God, there are many ramifications of that difference. So there is this, even if we can see a lot of those other things, and this is so important and has so many ramifications that it can't be missed. So the first point is the translatability of that we saw witnessed among all the other people groups around them is ultimately rejected in ancient Israel, if only gradually and inconsistently. A second point I would make, another remarkable feature of Israelite religion appears to be the anachronism at its core. As we have seen in this brief survey, physical representations of the divine image were so central to ancient Near Eastern religion, it is nearly inconceivable they could have articulated truths about their God or their gods without it. I often talk about the difference of what the Ark of the Covenant makes, what the difference it makes. I mean, when the Philistines captured on the battlefield, what did they think they had? Well, they were looking for a divine idol. The Babylonians tear down the temple and they go in, think of Nebuzaradan running in, to burn down the city and going to the holy place like all the other people groups of the ancient world looking for the divine image, and they see a box. What must they have thought? How different this is from everything else in their known existence and experience. And so this is another remarkable feature. By contrast, idolatry in the Hebrew scriptures is prohibited as a corrupting moral perversity and the very essence of perfidy and covenant unfaithfulness. Such aversion to idol worship is remarkable against the backdrop of religion in the ancient world. And then third, historicizing. A further element of Israel's underlying religious conceptions is perhaps the most characteristic feature of Israelite religion, a theologization of history, in a process accompanied by a transition from anthropomorphism to anthropocentrism. So anthropomorphism is making all the gods in human form, and what Israel did was sort of the opposite of that. I love in Deuteronomy 4 when the text says, well, what did you see? What did you see when you're there? And they say, well, we saw fire. Well, did you really see fire? No, we saw smoke. And the smoke was rising to the heart of heaven, it says. Well, you can't make an idol. You can't make an idol because you didn't see anything, right? I mean, that's the aversion they had to idolatry. Instead, the transverse of that was historicization. Israel's worship of Yahweh was cosmic, political, perhaps even had mythic dimensions. But the apex of its conceptualization of Yahweh is as the one who intervenes in their history. Elsewhere in the ancient world, history was just a field of possible interventions by the gods, favorable or unfavorable. But in Israel, history becomes the one coherent connection of events, stretching from creation, they even add creation into their history telling, until the end of the world, a sequence known as Historia Sacra in Judeo-Christian tradition. And this move has further consequences as creation becomes simply a work of God. Worship is centralized in one location before one Yahweh, Lord of history. Stories of the divine image, Historia Divina, formerly conceived in mythological language, becomes Historia Sacra, the story of one Yahweh and his one people, Israel. A further consequence, these are all just ramifications of the historicization of their thought. Further consequence of Israel's theologizing of history is the canonization of revealed truth, which cannot be experienced by future generations in the same immediate way, but which can be codified for them in perpetuity. So I'm suggesting that all of this eventually resulted in the Bible. The idea that we can write down these things in historical form and pass them down through the generations. Every time I think about this, I ran across recently this quote, which I can't see at this angle, so I have to step out to see this. Taken as a whole, the historical framework of the Hebrew Bible is a meta-narrative that no culture that has received it has ever been able to escape. Interesting. Now, my fourth point here is these distinctive elements bring us back to the task of defining monotheism in any meaningful way when discussing ancient Israel. Assuming some limited value of the term monotheism, many scholars address its inadequacy by modifying it with adjectives, such as explicit monotheism, implicit monotheism, emergent monotheism, diffuse monotheism, and several others. One scholar has helpfully traced Israel's religious history from monolatrous henotheism, so the worship of only one God, even though they weren't denying the existence of others. One scholar, this is Baruch Halpern, has defined that as unself-conscious monotheism, my last bullet point here, which just is a genuine philosophical monotheism, became genuinely philosophical monotheism in the exile. Neely Fox, someone else known to you, I say here of HUC fame, used anthropological evidence from African religions to argue for a diffused monotheism in ancient Israel, in which Yahweh was a supreme God complemented and supplemented by other divine functionaries to whom he has delegated certain portions of his authority. So let me try to draw some conclusions here. Turning again to the textual data that we had on the board a few moments ago, the message of the Hebrew Bible may be said to be more than monotheism, not less than. In other words, the authors of Israel's literature hardly had divine math in view. They were unconcerned about the numbers of supernatural or preternatural beings in the cosmos, but were more narrowly concerned with their readers' commitment and devotion to the one Yahweh, who was, in most of these texts, singularly bounded. He's not fluid, he's not translatable, and without familial relationships with other beings, and alone at the top of any imagined divine hierarchy. So this makes their perception of him distinctive in every one of these respects. I think we're justified in calling this affective monotheism, as distinct from other underlying religious conceptions of the ancient world. Some have used the phrase affective monotheism to denote generally, in fact, I traced it back 100 years ago to an obscure German article who wasn't talking about this at all. So I'm taking the phrase because I think it has more selling power, more persuasive power. Some have used the phrase to denote generally a devotional attachment of a pious individual to a particular deity. I propose here the phrase is useful in a narrower definition for the message of the Hebrew Bible, which calls for the denial of all other deities as objects of one's affection. The question of whether other gods actually exist seems irrelevant. It's almost unaddressed in the Hebrew literature. Those deities simply must not exist in one's self-consciousness as deserving of adulation, adoration, there's more here, or consideration. Last sentence. This is not a monotheism that insists on a theoretical or philosophical elimination of polytheism per se, but rather a henotheism of a particularly potent stripe, which is a quote from Christopher Seitz. In other words, it's a monotheism which is calling its readers to only worship and serve one deity, and essentially not to even think about the other ones. It's like you don't see them there. Just imagine they're not even there. Are they really there? Well, yeah, that's why we have the first two commandments. But you don't even have to worry about that. So that ends the discussion, and I'm going to take some questions now if you're ready. Let's say the question again, how I interpret the 40 references to Asherah. So it's true that most of them have very similar contexts. It's almost impossible to answer that question, right? Because every context has to determine its meaning in that location. But most of those occurrences are in First and Second Kings, many of them, and have a very similar context. I think the evidence from Kuntiladaj Rud, which may be a text that the rabbi has in mind, illustrates that what you have in the Bible is the official religion, and that there were people who didn't get it right. There were people on the fringes who were worshiping, and however you interpret that particular text and the inscription, whether the inscription goes with the text, whether it's separate, lots of questions around that. But the possibility that God was worshipped along with a wife, an Asherah, or there are lots of different ways to interpret it. So I'm not suggesting that everybody in ancient Israel was on board and well-informed and fully formed by the doctrines that you have in the text. So I do think there's evidence that other things were going on in a popular vein. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Campen. We were here together. It's about 100 years ago, John, right? I'm sorry? Oh, repeat the question for John. Yes. Right. Abigail, do you want to repeat that, or would you? Okay, so I should repeat the question. Wow, John, thank you. There's several questions in that question. So if I get it straight, I'm supposed to repeat this for the Zoom observers. You're asking about the timing of these things, since most of the texts we looked at were Deuteronomy 4 and Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, so that's late. And then also that I began with the late Bronze Age. So I should qualify that I don't think anybody in the late Bronze Age ever actually achieved monotheism. I mean, monotheism, the term, is a 17th century British philosophy term, which was devised actually its binary form was to speak against polytheism. So we use it etymologically to deny the existence of the other deities, and that's not what these texts were doing. So I don't think the Bronze Age reached that, and I don't think we should really say anything about true ontological monotheism until the Second Temple period. That's why I say it's monotheizing. These are the texts, and these are the teachings that evolved in true monotheism later on. So even in the 6th century, I would say that's why I'm using affective monotheism. I think if you go back to the Ten Commandments, or you go back to the Shema, or as far, I don't know, we all have to date these texts in different ways, don't we? However we date these things, I think the Hebrew Bible itself is about affective monotheism. And I'm using, like everybody else, an adjective to modify what I mean by monotheism. It's not ontological, philosophical monotheism, but it's really monolatry. But it's such an extreme form of monolatry, you're not even supposed to think about the other. It's more than that, too. I don't know. Am I answering the question, John? Am I convincing you? He's sort of, he's thinking. Oh, yes, I think so. Yeah, I would say that. We're talking about developments within their religious conceptions. I mean, that's the way I was asked to read everybody else's opinion about all the other gods, all the other nations. What's their conception of their deities? So yeah, good. This question, there's one here and then one in the back. We'll take this one first.
What does editing have any bearing on your interpretation? Because the Sumerian corpus ends its editing relatively early, whereas you have the Hebrew Bible edited much later, and I think more robust redactions and levels and layers and sort of ideologies factoring in there. Does that bear on how we reconstruct the pantheon of those cultures?
The pantheon of the other cultures?
I mean, the Israelites.
Yeah. So the question has to do with editing, the editing of the texts, and if I'm reading into the question, maybe if true monotheism came in at the editing stage.
The Assyrian text, the Enuma Elish, for example, that sort of has an end point.
Yes.
Whereas the Hebrew Bible continues to be edited much later.
Right.
And I'm wondering what if the monotheistic tendencies that you see through are
actually much later from editing? It's such an excellent question. So the question is whether the later editing of the text, as it was done, many centuries later, might have sort of layered true monotheism over those texts. I want to think about that one some more. It's such a good question. I think the editing. Well, I could take a Van Ceder's approach and say, what editing? There's no editing in the Bible. There's the disappearing editor, which I don't think is correct. So that wouldn't be fair to me. But I think there would be more evidence. I think there would be more evidence that we could see the hand of the editor changing a text that was something like polytheism, if it were something like these other nation groups, and turning that into an affective monotheism or true monotheism. I think we could see more of that. Now, maybe this question about the Asherah and the Baals, maybe that would be it. Maybe this is how later editors have, changed that. But I'm not sure I don't see that yet.
Yeah, I was thinking of like Jephthah. Your God gave you your land.
Yeah.
Our God gave us.
Yes, that had to. Yeah, Deuteronomy 32 does something similar of God assigning all the deities to the different people groups. Yeah. That doesn't sound too monotheizing, does it? So there are, I say in a part that I cut out that I also don't want to flatten the text. One of my qualifiers early on, or caveats, was that I wasn't going to be getting into the dating of all these texts. So yeah, there are certain texts where we have the divine council, and we can name them. There's several of those, and so it's interesting. They weren't edited out really. They were nuanced and folded in, pretty much as they stand apparently. So they were comfortable with that, which I think maybe would be a case for the idea that they saw these other deities out there, but they were trying not to think about them. Yeah. 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 Well, this is good that these questions came in this sequence. So this is asking about Psalm 82, and I'm thinking Genesis 6 instead of Genesis 10, actually, with the sons of God and the daughters of men and all that. And I think along with the question of editing, we would say yes. I don't believe, and there's been a lot done recently on scribal culture, and I don't know how much time I'm supposed to go, so I could talk too long about this. So okay. There's a lot been done recently on scribal culture, and I'm not one who believes, as much as I've tried to keep up with all the literature on this, that the Israelite scribes threw anything out. The editing process that I believe happened is very specific. A written text, or a sefer, was very sacred, and the sepharim were never sliced and diced and pieces thrown away. I think everything was folded in. So something like Genesis 6, the first 4 verses are there really to justify the flood. Now, if you ask me, well, what did the original author, whatever that would be, think about this intermarriage of preternatural beings? And I'm not sure I can answer that, because I'm not sure they thought much about it. It was a text, and they weren't going to discard it. And so they found a way to use it and fold it in. And that would apply to some of these other things too. By the way, I think I'm going to tread on your territory a little if I say this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the idea of preternatural beings, there are other beings out there. They're not worthy of Elohim, but they're also not merely humans. This gave rise to angelology in the Second Temple period. This was now evolved. It evolved into something else. So in that sense, monotheizing is really just one piece of a flow of these texts into the later periods. Oh, oh, I don't know what to do with Job 1 and 2. Yeah. So say again, Jason. Yeah. Well, and you have also, I mean, when the woman at Endor brings up Samuel, who apparently has the same words to say to Saul that he said in life. Why are you bothering me? The same message now that I had before I died. But as you all know the text, it's an Elohim. It's an Elohim coming up out of the ground. Well, this is raising the same question, isn't it? This is how they didn't see him. That version of Samuel was not Yahweh. It was not even really Elohim, but it was a spiritual being, a preternatural essence. Who, by the way, was really annoyed, right? As he was in life, kind of quickly. So I guess I'm not giving answers to some of these questions. Yeah, the B'nai Elohim, you're saying, sounded like deities there. Right, sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I would put that together with Psalm 82 and Genesis 6 and 7. Now, that was a little different, of course, because you've got it set up as a narrative and a frame for introducing the poem. So that's a whole different question. And I am not sure what else to say about that. Okay. Oh, we have a really good Zoom question. Mm. So you all heard that question here in this audience. Oh, no. Oh, so in Exodus, the portrayal of God as supreme over the Egyptian deities and how that might inform Israelite thinking. I think it's really interesting. I used to think, and I've changed my mind about this, that the plagues were attacking one particular Egyptian god. And I don't believe that's the case. I think it starts with the Nile, because the Nile and Pharaoh were central to everything else in the society. But the other plagues were not directly attacking any particular Egyptian deity. But the whole thing does present a system of putting Egypt in its place, so to speak. The very revelation of God's name in chapter 3, which may be behind Tom's question, is, that's such a great text. Tell them Yahweh, tell them Adonai sent you. It's first of all a wordplay, and I don't think that we can say that this is saying it's, the name Adonai itself goes back to the verb to be. Maybe it does. That's the scholarly consensus, or it has been. Maybe that's true. But in that text, it's a wordplay on God's very existence. And the fact is, he exists, and this may be behind Tom's question, in a way that the other gods in Egypt don't exist. So, I sound like I'm speaking against what I just said now. But it certainly informed the Israelites that this Adonai, this Yahweh, is very, very different from any Elohim they've ever imagined or thought about. At least that much. That's why I say I think the emphasis on monotheism is reductionistic, and it makes the message of the Hebrew Bible lesser than, rather than getting to the heart of the actual message of the Hebrew Bible, which is what I've called effective monotheism, and at the heart really of its message. I don't know if that answers Tom's great question or not, but we'll draw a line.